Hello, everybody. I'd like to introduce you to session 4. And in this session, we're going to be talking about places, networks and partnerships and new ways of doing businesses that are based in localities and geographical locations. I'm particularly keen on this as an approach to stimulate growth. As the coordinator for Birmingham as a social enterprise place, and also the Digbeth Social Enterprise Quarter, but also in recognition of the numbers of clusters and groupings of social enterprises that we have, particularly here in Birmingham, but also across the whole of the West Midlands region. And I know that social enterprises use the connections that they make in places to identify new business opportunities, to work together, to develop partnerships, to form consortiums and so on. And I really welcome the opportunity to have this conversation. So joining me on this platform now for this session is Nick Plumb from Power to Change, is Tony Armstrong from Locality, and Simon Wilson from the Pioneer Group. So welcome them, and let's begin the conversation about places. Just waiting for Nick. I'm sure he'll be here any second. But maybe if he's going to join us shortly, I might slightly change the order and ask if you're going to do 8 minutes each, and you're going to talk to us about places and the opportunities that they create for growth. And I think, Tony, I'm going to ask you to kick off rather than Nick. Is that okay?
Sure.
Thank you very much. Go for it.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Great to be with you all today. So we're thinking about the kind of exam question that was set for me. I think for me, I just wanted to kind of pick a few themes that we've been talking about at Locality. So the first one is about the nature of power and how that impacts around enterprise, because for us, this is about generating, unlocking the power of community that we believe is there in every single neighbourhood, estate or village, anywhere that people live. And thinking a little bit about, we've been doing quite a lot of existential thinking, as I'm sure many of you have, around the business model itself. Is it dead? Is it still fit for purpose? What does it mean coming out of the pandemic in terms of the challenges for trading and for enterprising activity? And then thinking about how we build a supportive environment. So through that networking, through enabling and support from government, from other players in a local area as well. So to start off with, the thing that Locality bangs on about all the time is this concept of the power of community. For us, it's about making sure that people feel connected to their local place. They have a stake in terms of local decisions, which impacts their local area. They have a role, a stake, play a part in the design and the delivery of services that impact on local areas, and that they support the local economy, in particular through enterprising activity and also the ownership and management of assets. And our kind of approach, or our theory of change, if you like, is that you need strong, capable, community-led organisations operating in places to give people a voice, to provide a conduit for local people, to advocate for the area with other important stakeholders in the local area, and to operate as part of an ecosystem. So our members, we've got 1,300 of them across England. They very much work independently of the private and the public sector, but also work interdependently with them. They can't do what they do unless they form strong partnerships and collaboration at a local level. So for us, that ecosystem, that concept of a local network is absolutely vital for the success of enterprise. Enterprise and assets has run through our network really significantly. I think if you ask most of our members, and some of them may well be here, they would say that actually their primary goal is to improve the lot of people living in their local area. Using enterprise, using the ownership and management of assets is the means to delivering those improvements for local people in the local place. But it's a really important part of what they do. It brings independence. It brings obviously the ability to fund some of the activities that they want to do, but it brings that independence that they can fund the type of things that they know local people need, and that will support the local area. So clearly, everything turned upside down last spring with the pandemic, and I think there was a real sense from a lot of our members that they felt they've been doing all the things that everybody, we and funders, government, have been telling them to do for decades, actually, which is diversify their funding, generate sources of trading, generate sources of earned income, and lo and behold, all of that shut off overnight. So what we found, we did a survey in the spring and summer last year of our members, and about half of our members reported that they'd already lost 25% of their income in the first 3 to 4 months of the pandemic, and even kind of half of that amount lost around half of their income. So obviously the ones that were more heavily reliant on trading activity were the ones that were hardest hit, so they had a much bigger impact. And actually we found a little bit of a strata in terms of the size of organisations. So the very smallest organisations in the main were able to mothball a lot of their activities, use the furlough scheme. Bigger ones were a little bit more resilient. Some of them might have even had that kind of holy grail of reserves that they were able to dip into, but many of them have lots of contract income. And we know that there was a great deal of flexibility on the part of local authorities in being able to relax some of the contractual obligations. And that really, really helped some of the larger ones. But the ones in the middle who were more reliant on trading income, they were the ones who were hardest hit. So we've been doing obviously a lot of thinking about, is this just a temporary blip? You know, we've been describing is there a fatal flaw in this model, or is it a kind of temporary trauma? And it's the latter really that we've kind of settled on. You'll all be pleased to hear we do think the model of social enterprise is a good one, and it has a lot to offer in the future, but that we need to make sure that we are all supporting how this rebuilds, and we do things in a different way that we've been doing before. So building a really supportive and enabling environment is a critical part of this. So I think there's a role for governments. You know, we're seeing an enormous amount of money being pumped into local areas through the various regeneration kind of themed funds that are coming through. So the Levelling Up Fund, the Community Renewal Fund, which will eventually become the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, you will all know about, and the Community Ownership Fund, which we're eagerly waiting more detail from government on how that will operate, or could be potentially transformational in some areas in terms of being able to drive the enterprising culture in a local place, to provide capital support, to provide revenue support, to be able to scale up activity, to get started, to help with the transfer and purchase of assets, which will help to build a sound, more sustainable business model for many organisations. But the kind of negative side of that is that we still don't think government fully appreciates what the sector can do, the benefits of the sector, how the sector operates. We saw that in terms of lots of the emergency support over the last year or so for organisations. Aside from being branded as supporting business rather than social enterprise and charity, many of the organisations in our membership were actually actively excluded from being able to bid for some of those support measures. Some of that was changed as a result of lobbying, but there isn't a kind of default support stance from government for some of these. So we all need to work hard to make sure that the voice of social enterprise, community enterprise, is heard by governments, because we do, and we can play even bigger role in supporting local economic development, growth, and connecting people to their local area as well. So we've all got that for our to-do list to do, and we do that by working together, building a movement, being stronger, and using the evidence, the fantastic track record across all of our various networks and movements to demonstrate that scale for change. So a key thing nationally will be to lobby for making sure that those kinds of funds are designed in a way that best supports the needs of local organisations who are working in this social enterprise sphere. But locally, partnerships are really important as well. So one of the things we've been doing is to really encourage our members to just double down on some of the relationships that they will already have with their local authority, critically, but also with their local MP in terms of accessing funding from the Levelling Up Fund, where MPs have a role in supporting bids. So using your influence to the max, if you're not already, to make sure that the needs, the ideas, the innovation that you are bringing through the work that you're doing is understood and valued by the local authority, because they're the ones who are going to be accessing a lot of the support. And then the other side of the network networking for us is around making sure that we're all learning from each other. So Locality runs obviously lots of different events and networking opportunities. A critical thing for us is peer learning across our network. Someone somewhere has been there, seen there, done it, got the scars, got the experience. The downsides of working from home is that you constantly get deliveries, if you can hear my doorbell.
I think it's time shortly anyway.
So networking is critically important, and we need to work with each other, and we need to support each other, both to practical help for guidance, moral support, emotional support often, but also use our voice collectively. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. That's been really interesting, and I think there's some real food for thought there in terms of the approaches you're suggesting. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Nick and ask Nick to give us your perspective on places, networks and partnerships and new ways of doing business.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. And yeah, apologies about the technical difficulties there. It wouldn't be a conference during the pandemic without it. So yeah, I'm Nick from Power to Change. And for those that don't know us, we're an independent charitable trust that supports community business in England. We believe that no one understands a community better than the people that live there. So really pleased to be speaking at this session on places, partnerships and everything that comes with that. And we work with community businesses to revive local assets, protect the services people rely on and address local needs. And there's lots of crossover between the types of community businesses we support and the organisations in Locality's membership. So yeah, hopefully lots of shared themes there. And for us, a community business is locally rooted. They trade for the benefit of the local community. They're accountable to the local community, and they have that kind of broad community impact. I think it's really clear that we're at a transition point. We hope that we're on the way out of lockdown for good. And with that comes the opportunity for social enterprises, community businesses to re-engage with their communities and bring businesses back into full operation. However, we also know that there's not this desire to return to normal, and that lots of things won't return to normal in the way that we've seen them. I think there are both challenges and opportunities with this. The pandemic has left really deep scars in our country. It's exposed the weaknesses of many of our public services, shone a light on some of the deep inequalities that existed before the pandemic and will continue to exist once the threat has subsided. It's caused huge economic damage, which I fear is yet to be fully felt. I think that rising unemployment is likely to be one of the consequences, and social enterprise and community business has a real role to play in tackling that rising unemployment through provision of jobs and kind of employment and skill support service. And as Tony highlighted there, many charities, social enterprises are struggling financially due to the impact of the pandemic. So I want to focus quite a bit of my talk on today is the high street. And I think that the decline of the high street was a fact of life before the pandemic, and that this trend has been accelerated by the closure of non-essential retail and people's heightened reliance on online shopping. So there are some real challenges, but I also think despite that challenging outlook, there are opportunities for and reasons for optimism. I think for many, the pandemic has reset relationships with place and community. So the way that people came together to support the vulnerable, especially during the early stages of the pandemic was really awe-inspiring. And this was accompanied by, in some cases, not all, the breaking down of barriers and forging of new relationships, especially between councils and communities in place, to meet that challenge head on. People have spent much more time close to home, that's obvious, but recent polling that I've seen from Demos suggests that that's set to continue into the future, which represents real opportunity. Tackling the climate crisis has shot up the political agenda over the last 12 months, and it has become a cliche. But I think there is a genuine desire to build back better. Whether that intent translates into action remains to be seen. So yeah, just to focus in a little bit, I want to talk a bit about high streets and then a bit more about community ownership, which Tony touched on. So as I said, I think the kind of retail dominated model of the high street has been dying for some years now. So in part that's driven by the growth of out of town retail stores, but also by the rise of online shopping. And this has been accelerated by the pandemic. We've seen that businesses with a strong online offer have fared better, but especially those large multinationals like Amazon. And we've seen household names like Debenhams, Arcadia Group, Topshop, Dorothy Perkins, Miss Selfridge, and so on collapse. But I also think there's a growing recognition among developers, property owners, that they need to diversify. So if they continue to receive rent on their property, they need to increase footfall on the high street. And I think one of the ways of doing this is through the diverse community businesses, art centres, community pubs, places offering creative activities and so on. And I also think there's a growing recognition among councils that they need to play a more activist role in their town centres if they are to halt their decline. And we're really beginning to see this kind of future model of a civic high street that's fit for the 21st century. We're seeing it in places like Plymouth, places like Dumfries, where they have the mid-steeple quarter, Hastings, and elsewhere. And town centres are so important because they're real sources of civic pride that matter to people. I read Deborah Mattinson's recent book, Beyond the Red Wall, and she spoke about the importance of the presence on the high street of a Marks and Spencer's, widely respected British high street brand, for people's perceptions of their local place. And I think we need to ask how we move to a point where people's pride in place is not driven by the presence of a particular retailer, but instead by a diverse mix of uses and businesses, and one in which all sorts of activity happens on the high street, as was the case kind of in the early 20th century. That could include health and well-being hubs and community organisations on high streets, and really having those community-owned spaces that revitalise some of this and act as a kind of destination which draws people into their high streets. As I mentioned, I think there are some real exciting opportunities and examples of where this is already happening. So Nudge Community Builders in Plymouth is a really inspiring story of a local street, Union Street, that has been transformed bit by bit by the community. Back in the 70s, it was a kind of bustling, busy destination for a night out. Since then, it's seen decline, rising property vacancy, and all the challenges that come with that. Hannah and Wendy, who are the two women driving the project there, have been bringing buildings back into use that the market otherwise wouldn't go near, and breathing new life into their high streets. But that's a slow process and a challenging process. They've faced real challenges around lack of clarity on ownership, who owns the derelict buildings that they're trying to bring into community ownership. And it takes many years for those to become sustainable. So they need grants to help them through those early stages of running a business. And that's something that Power to Change have supported Nudge on in recent years. And I think that another example is, mid-steeple quarter that I mentioned. So in Scotland, this is a kind of partnership between the Dumfries and Galloway Council and its local community to take over a whole section of a street in Dumfries. Really demonstrates how local authorities can support communities to take ownership of a group of disused buildings and refurbish them and steward them for the community. But I think this has been supported by a better kind of legislative framework in Scotland. You have a Community Power Act, you have a genuine community right to buy, you have the Scottish Land Fund. All of these things are kind of really central to that. But as Tony touched on earlier, things are changing here in England too. So at the budget, we had the announcement of the £150 million Community Ownership Fund. This is something that the sector has been campaigning for some time. I think it is, and we should kind of applaud that it's happened, and it will help communities to buy, take over local community assets at risk of being lost, to run them as community-owned businesses. But it's really important that this is done in the right way, and the detail really matters. it means giving communities the flexibilities to use grants to develop their ideas and make sure that the match funding rules, which have been pointed to as part of the community ownership fund, are flexible enough to not lock out deprived areas where it might be tricky to raise the necessary match funding. So we'll be campaigning on that as we go forward, along with others in the sector too. But what I think this really tells us is that there are huge opportunities for locally rooted social enterprises as we build back from the pandemic. I think community ownership is a ready-made solution to rising vacancy on our high streets, and there is that real desire in people for these town centres to look very different to how they have in the past, and for these local high streets to play a bigger role in people's lives. Just to end, I think that the European Super League story that was in the news over the past few days, as a football fan, it's kind of captured my attention, but I also think it's provides some kind of broader inspiration for this sort of work. Firstly, I think the fact that it's already been pulled, having never truly got off the ground, shows the importance of people power and that vocal opposition to something that doesn't seem right. But secondly, I think it's really shone a light on why ownership matters. The whole project was driven by distant owners, detached from the communities they operate in. And I think this points us to a point where the time couldn't be any better to make the case for community ownership as we look to recovery from the pandemic. So that's all from me. Thanks very much.
That's fantastic, Nick. Again, some really interesting points: community ownership, high streets, the role of the sector post-pandemic. I think they're really valuable. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Simon, who's going to come at this conversation from a slightly different perspective, because he works in a community, and I think he's going to tell us a little bit about how you're stimulating social businesses within the Pioneer Group and within Castle Vale and beyond. Thanks, Simon.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah. So I'm Simon Wilson. I'm Chief Executive of the Pioneer Group. For those of you not familiar with us, we're a social landlord, not for profit. We manage around 2,500 homes in a place called Castle Vale, predominantly in North Birmingham. Got a turnover of about 13 million and employ about 120 staff. The organisation was born out of adversity. The Castle Vale area was a kind of 60s utopian vision of outer suburban development, which was predominantly high rise, high density. Within a generation, it was probably one of the worst estates in Birmingham. I'm told back in the day, if you wanted to find your stolen car, you just had to drive around Castle Vale. It was, a huge area of decline, and all the social ills that come with that. How we've managed to turn that around is through partnership, and one of the stories through my presentation will be all about how important partnership is. But we've sustained regeneration because the Housing Action Trust that was brought in to drive that had a kind of eye on legacy and a real understanding that in order to sustain regeneration, you need anchor organisations that are there for the long haul. So the creation of our housing association has created one of those anchor organisations, but there was a whole fabric and infrastructure required to maintain not just the physical well-being of the neighbourhood, but the well-being of the people living there. So tackling education and kind of soft people skills, employment, and all of those things have been what our mission has been since those early days, nearly 30 years ago. And central to that has been the kind of voice of the customer, the voice of residents, who are massively involved in all decision making within our organisation, right through to the group board and through the governance structure. Not all housing associations are the same. We often share values that are similar, but we all have different flavours. We do some interesting things on Castle Vale, such as community asset transfer. So Nick mentioned football. I find myself managing a football stadium on Castle Vale, which wasn't quite sure how I've managed to do that. But the reality was it was a failing stadium. It's right in the heart of our community, and we've managed to secure around £1 million worth of inward investment, partly through the FA, to put a 3G pitch on there. The local charity, Spitfire Services, they have taken asset transfer of the library and are running the swimming pool. So as a community, when things aren't going our way, we kind of come together and tackle issues. And kind of post austerity, you know, these were kind of lacking in investment through the city council and government. So the community just said, look, no, we're not going to lose our football stadium, we're not going to lose the swimming pool and the library, we're going to do something about it. And you know, that embracing of partnership and collaboration is served us well, and it helps us to deliver our mission of making lives and communities better. I was asked to reflect on the last year in terms of the pandemic. So like all businesses, you know, that's dominated our business for the last year. You know, we've worked in partnership to deliver immediate support through volunteering. Obviously, you know, we've managed to raise a huge amount of money to deliver a kind of response service, and that has involved delivering, I think, nearly 3,000 food parcels and medication and shopping to our residents. You know, we've recruited nearly 140 befriending volunteers through a kind of telebuddy service, and I'm told we've made nearly 14,000 welfare calls to vulnerable and isolated individuals through that time, and clocked up something like 16,500 volunteer hours. The interesting reflection I've got on that is that, yes, as a business, we triggered our business continuity plan and gave some structure to the response, but there was a huge amount of kind of bottom up, you know, staff, volunteers, members of the community, organizations, all coming forward with ideas and just getting on and making sound decisions in a responsive way. And I think that's born out of kind of organizational values, but also a real sense of community on the Vale. So that involved people and neighbours and whole streets coming together to kind of respond to the crisis we were faced with. I think the other reflection I've got is that staff have found the last year incredibly difficult. So on the one hand, they've responded in an incredibly resilient way, but we've had a real focus around staff welfare because we had to become agile in about 2. If it was on my business plan, it would have taken us a year, but we did it in about 10 days. But there's been an impact from that, and we've been really focused on thinking about the impacts on individuals of how we've worked over the last year. I think the other thing to reflect on is just how important building new relationships has been over the last year. So whilst there's been this history of partnership, still new organisations, new community groups, faith groups in particular across Erdington come together in new partnerships and built new relationships, and we're really keen to hold on to those. And I guess the question is, does it take a crisis to build those relationships? And I'd like to think not. In terms of challenges and opportunities then, so, you know, Castle Vale is apparently, according to the 2019 indices of multiple deprivation, the 4th worst neighbourhood in the city. It doesn't feel like that, and our whole attitude to Castle Vale is actually a strength-based, assets-based approach. So, you know, if you just looked at raw data, you wouldn't really get a feel for the place. What I do know is that we've got a long-term approach. You know, the whole purpose of an anchor organisation is that we, as a housing association, have a crazy approach where we've got a 30-year business plan. That's not unusual in our sector, but for most commercial businesses, when I say you've got a 30-year business plan, they kind of look at me as though I'm a bit daft, really. But, you know, we are bricks and mortar. We're hardwired into this community, and that does allow us to take long-term decisions and have long-term plans for the neighbourhood, where we really are trying to turn around almost institutional inequalities in the community, so we can take long-term plans and make long-term decisions. Some of the work we're doing most recently has been through a partnership of anchor institutions in Birmingham. So they're the big spenders in the city, the big employers, people like the City Council, Police and Crime Commissioner, the 2 universities, university hospitals. And why is Little Old Pioneer part of that partnership? It's because if you think about it, the kind of spending power through procurement, the amount of staff that get employed by those organisations, does that really reach out into the kind of communities in the outer suburbs of Birmingham like Castle Vale? And the reality is, no, it hasn't historically. So that kind of inward investment approach and making sure that we're maximising the return for our communities in the city is what that partnership's all about. So over the pandemic, we've kind of reframed some of that work So we've piloted an approach where we're trying to get people who have been impacted by the pandemic from an employment perspective. So they may be young people whose job opportunities leaving education weren't as they thought, or they may be people who have lost their job or suffered some kind of impact around their employment. And we've been trying to use that partnership to kind of transfer those skills. So people maybe who have been working in hospitality have got transferable skills into the university hospital and the NHS. So we've been relatively successful with that pilot, and we've now managed to secure some additional funding to mainstream that approach over the coming months. So, you know, that cross partnership working is massively important to us. Asset-based development, you know, so really focusing on the strengths of a community is also crucial, and try to drive those kind of wider community benefits by how you spend your money as a business, and just a kind of engagement in industrial strategies and inclusive growth is really important for us. And I think increasingly housing associations are seeing themselves as being much more at the forefront and proactive in these kind of initiatives. If I turn now to kind of thinking about, well, what have we learned, and where maybe there's some transferable ideas and experience. As has been mentioned by the previous speakers, that there's clearly going to be an economic impact of the pandemic, and you kind of pays your economists and you takes your pick as to how deep that curve is and how the bounce back is going to be. But my take on this is that what I do know is that the economic impact will yet again disproportionately impact the kind of communities that we work in. So, you know, how do we want to position ourselves to build partnerships, to kind of engage in our communities, and build partnerships with organizations that have got shared values, shared ethos, you know, a desire to create great places for people to live, and all the constituent parts that make a great place. And why can't that involve social enterprise? So, you know, how do we as organizations, including social enterprises, tap into that kind of community response that we've seen such a positive community response in the last year? How do we tap into that? How do we kind of keep hold of that shared sense of doing things for ourselves, of doing things differently? You know, what is the kind of local place-based focus that we want to see? Because I think there's a real opportunity there. And I think there's also a real opportunity for social landlords to link in with social enterprise. You know, we're anchor organizations. Social enterprise is often rooted in place. You know, how can we jointly put ourselves at the heart of that kind of social economic recovery, and make it place-based? It feels like we've got a heck of a lot in common. I genuinely kind of buy into the idea that some of those old economic models and people's appetite for them has been shaken over the last year. You know, how do we want to tap into some of those sentiments and build our economies back in a different way, on a different footing, with a different relationship with our communities? I think Nick touched on, you know, our high streets, we're told they're going to look different. I'm not sure there's a consensus on what looking different quite looks like at the moment, but we've got an opportunity surely to change what our high streets look like in our communities. We have got a history of, you know, working with stakeholders to redesign what practice looks like. You know, we've just become a very agile organization very quickly. And the principle to holding on to that from my perspective going forwards is that it's got to work for the customer. You know, it's got to work for the community. If it happens to work for our staff and that works for our business, then great, but they've got to come first. And in any period of change, you know, I think that opportunities are emerging and will continue to emerge. And, you know, how can social enterprise, which my perception is, and my understanding is, it's incredibly agile. You know, it feels very fleet of foot as a sector. And, you know, that word pivot seems to keep cropping up, but it feels like social enterprise has got a real opportunity here to kind of pivot and shift and take advantage of the kind of potentially quite exciting times we have got going forwards. And I'll finish there.
Well, thank you very much, all of you. I think that's been really insightful, and it's been really great to hear of your different perspectives. And I think that it was, for me as well, it was really helpful to hear Simon's perspective, because you're doing it in reality and you were able to talk about your experience with regard to COVID and what the response has been, and the opportunities that you see. So I want to kind of throw it open to a kind of four-way conversation now, and then I'll pick up on some of the questions. But my first thought is that we're all coming at this from different perspectives, and we're all seeking community cohesion. We're all seeing community empowerment and so on. What do you think that we should be doing generally to connect social enterprises into communities, to connect them with opportunities? Whose responsibility is it? How should we go about it? What could be done? Anyone like to answer? Simon, do you want to go?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, you know, there are already, I mean, what the nice thing about my sector, the social housing sector, and I think partly because we're not for profit, so we've got this in common, isn't it? Is that, you know, there's a willingness to work in partnership. There's a willingness to collaborate. There's a willingness to share in the way that, you know, you don't have to be quite as guarded when you've not got shareholders to worry about and profit margins to worry about in the same way. So I think, you know, my experience of partnership is if you've got shared values and you've got a drive and a desire to have the same kind of outcomes, then it's about getting around the table. And, you know, Birmingham's full of great partnership examples of partnership working. You know, I've mentioned the work that we've been doing with anchor institutions, but we've got social housing partnership that I'm involved with, got the West Midland approach. We as a sector have got the National Housing Federation who kind of lobby on our behalf, but often pull partnerships together as well. And I think from my perspective, there's a kind of open invitation and a real desire to kind of broaden those partnerships out to other organizations, including social enterprise. Why wouldn't we want to do that? Because I think we do have shared values.
Great, that's great. And also you talked about your anchor institutions and the role that the connections with those can play in terms of creating employment opportunities, but also supply chain opportunities. And Nick, what do you think from Power to Change's perspective? Who's response? You know, how do people do this stuff?
I mean, I think the first thing to recognise is that it's hard. It takes time to build those relationships, and I think that something like the pandemic provided a good focal point which people organised around, certainly at that the level of engaging with statutory sector bodies as social enterprises. I think that had a positive impact on that sort of stuff. The way that I think is useful to think about is just, so there's partnership with other players in a local place at a neighbourhood level and more broadly at a kind of citywide and regional level. I also think it's important to think about partnerships with communities. And I think that having a kind of governance model that involves local people in the running and direction of an organisation is really important in ensuring you keep that link with your communities and remain rooted and connected to them. One of the things that struck me during the pandemic in talking to community businesses was that whilst lots of them do continue to have those kind of strong relationships with the communities they operate in, that actually over the past few years some of them had lost that link a little bit. The day-to-day pressures of running a business, working out where the next bit of funding's coming from, keeping the lights, all of that is challenging. And during the pandemic, and the kind of rise of things like mutual aid and that really grassroots type engagement with communities has reminded quite a few community organisations about the links that they should have with their communities, and I hope that has a kind of knock-on effect into the coming months and years.
Mm-hmm. Tony, what do you think?
I think Nick's right. Definitely what we've seen is a huge upscaling in that connection to local communities from organisations because they had to, and I definitely agree with what Simon was saying. Our experience was that our members were recasting their entire business and service models within hours in last March, and the local authorities were weeks behind, and kind of in the end that reset the relationship actually between a lot of local authorities and community enterprises. There's a newfound respect, and that's certainly been borne out in surveys of local government leaders. But the other kind of thing which really happened was that our member engagement has never been higher as an organisation. So the demand from people to connect with each other, to share learning, emotional support, really important throughout all of this as well. But technical support, just saying, look, we've had to do this. How do you do it? The one thing that always sticks in my mind, we've spent 2 years arguing internally about a digital strategy and a new website, and lo and behold, we've got one. We did it last night. It's so it drove it forced innovation. We shouldn't have to rely on such an awful thing to drive that innovation and partnership. But often, things just are unlocked, aren't they, through crisis and change, and that certainly happens. So what we need to do is to keep some of those positive things that have emerged from this awful mess that we've had for the last year and sustain them into the future.
Do you think that organisations need to make the links themselves, or do you think they should form themselves into a consortium and then approach others? Or I'm looking for really practical things that people can do that might be listening to this thinking, actually, I don't link in, because social enterprises are they're businesses at the foremost. Some of them come through communities, but some of them might be product or service linked, but there are they might it makes sense for them to connect with local communities. So how could they practically go about it?
I mean, the first thing I'd say is we talk to our members. It's a give-get type of relationship. So you need to make the effort to invest in networking, and you bring so many benefits out of it. Because it's often the thing at the bottom of, I've got many things to do. We need to sort out all of this stuff. I can't give up the time. And even people who know this to be true, when they actually spend the time with each other talking, they say, I'm so glad I managed to prioritise this. So it's just an important part of all of our development. We all need support and help from people. Then the second thing I'd say is that there are loads of networks already in existence, of course, so just access us, access Locality, access SEUK, access you, and other organisations regionally and locally. And there may be something that's really useful as part of that. So you don't need to feel as if you have to reinvent everything yourselves. There are networks available, and get in touch if you want to talk about that anymore. I think one of the things that we've been trying to encourage very much is local, really solid support networks as well. And I think this came into, we've been doing some work to support our members to form consortia, to be ready to bid for contracts and things. What we found the key lesson from that is that you need to have developed those relationships in a softer way, so that then you can really drive forward the joint working when an opportunity arises. It's very difficult to get people to focus on that real time to develop consortia without an actual opportunity and without those pre-existing relationships. So just, have dinner with each other once we can do that. Just chat to each other is really important, but use the existing networks that are there to help you facilitate it.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Did you want to say something, Nick?
Yeah, just to build on Tony's point, really, I think that's absolutely right about the time it takes to build consortia. I guess the kind of other side of that equation is just making sure that the approaches that organisations that might be commissioning or procuring services from social enterprises are doing that in a way that encourages consortia, because often we've found that the scale of contracts is so big that often smaller players can't compete when it comes to a commissioning process. So that again is something that I think requires all of us to keep pushing local government especially, but other organisations in that space to use those commissioning processes, which really do encourage collaboration at a local level, because too often it works in a way that drives competition between local organisations, which in turn discourages partnership and consortia working, which I think is a real problem.
Simon, yeah, what do you
Yeah,
think?
no, I was just going to reflect on some of the anchor institution work around procurement and employment, because I think it's about being quite disruptive as well. I think it's about challenging the status quo, So some of these huge organizations in the city of Birmingham have got literally billions of pounds worth of spend. Now, if you're a procurement director, probably the last thing you're worried about is social enterprise. It's just, okay, well, how do we break that status quo? How do we kind of break down those existing models to kind of say, well, hold on a minute, you do need to start considering doing things differently, because actually your social outcomes are happening over there if you're not careful, and actually you're not connecting the two. So one of the things we've been trying to do is break that down into kind of something that feels achievable and bite-sized chunks, and kind of accessing kind of local supply chains, which aren't ever going to win a multi-million pound contract, but actually if it's spend under 20 grand, then they've got a fighting chance of having a go. So I think you've got to be quite disruptive and just start to think differently. And similarly, when we've been talking to the NHS about how they recruit, they're the first people to say, we use all the wrong language, we advertise in all the wrong places, we're really off-putting, we make it really difficult for people to get a job with the NHS, that's them telling us, and then they're asking us to help work with them to kind of access residents and people that have got skills that they're desperately in need of. So, I think just having those opportunities to have those conversations and challenge how things have been done. And I think, Tony's point about, effectively a burning platform. The last year has been a burning platform, and people have responded incredibly well. And 20 years ago, we had a burning platform on Castle Vale. It's not there anymore. But the frameworks of engagement with communities are what kind of helps you respond when the next burning platform comes along. And it's how do you maintain those structures and frameworks of community engagement and being tapped into the community when, frankly, things are going okay. But, we're only one step away from another crisis, whether it's an economic crisis or whatever. And it's about kind of maintaining that engagement when times are good is harder, and you just have to work harder at it.
That's wonderful. I'm going to draw this session to a close. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and views and perspectives on places and the importance of places in the current environment. I think they're obviously, they create many opportunities, as you've heard about, and I'm particularly going to highlight high streets. I'm particularly going to highlight procurement opportunities, but I'm also going to highlight that they create opportunities for really digging deep and creating massive impact, and I think that's especially important. So without further ado, I'm going to close this session, but I'm also going to play us out with a video that comes from our very own Lizzie Forrester, who's one of my colleagues, and she's done a video of social enterprises in Birmingham. After that, you've got a half an hour reprieve, and we look forward to seeing you back within half an hour for the final session. So the session 5 starts at 1:30. So we'll see you then, and play video.